Hello, hello. Mrs. Tobias, are you able to speak so I can test the speaker system?
Yeah, but I don't know why my picture's not there though. Wait a minute. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. If you can hear me and I can hear you, we're golden.
Okay. But how come I don't have a picture?
You're not worthy of a picture.
Huh?
On the bottom right, bottom left, do you see the stop video thing? Is there a line through it?
I see it. You know what? I'm so sorry. I guess it's I can now say senior moment. I don't know what I used to say when I was younger, but that's what I'll say now. Got it.
All right. So let's see. Go live. Go live. Make sure that's actually going live. Okay, good. It's going.
Father, I don't know about other people, but the passages you said up there, the ladder, to me it's blurry, and not in focus. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I have to drill up close to it to see it too.
Well, I guess while it is that way for Zoom, let me pin myself to the.
For the other?
Well, probably not. It also depends how big your screen is.
Because I got a printout anyway, so that's fine. I'm okay.
All right. So let's go ahead and begin with prayer, and then we will get into it. Go to step 19, because that's where we're starting. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, present in all places and filling all things, come and dwell in us, cleanse, restrain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord.
I mean.
All right. So, any questions or comments from our previous classes?
No.
Okay, good. So we left off on step 19. We had just finished step 18, which was kind of a booger bear of a of a step. And so with step 19, we're looking at kind of the way to combat a lot of these things on sleep, prayer, and psalm singing in chapel. So let's go ahead and begin with Mrs. Tobias on some of your overarching thoughts on step 19.
Well, my overall thinking is, I'm thinking this is when some of them blend together, is that that you have to be, again, ever vigilant and not be distracted.
That's it in a nutshell. Next step. Dr. Tobias?
About the same thing as she said. Ever vigilant. Don't let your mind wander.
All right. Does anyone have any other overarching thoughts? Because it sounds, I get the feeling for step 19 we're going to get a lot of the same things. Does anyone have any other different overarching thoughts on this before we get to the particulars?
I looked at the prayer part of step 19.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, the solitary prayers were the very few. And I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the why behind that. Is it because it's difficult to concentrate when you're praying by yourself? You're more likely to be tempted to be distracted?
Here's the thing, and we'll get to more into this later, but when you're by yourself, it's just you against the enemy, as it were. And so you are trying your best to pray when you are having an enemy that is trying to send any number of thoughts and distractions at you so that you are not able to pray. Whereas within, corporate prayer, oftentimes we can be jarred and forced to focus. But again, even then, it's on how we, react to it, whether or not we're going to enjoy the call to prayer or whether or not we consider it a nuisance. But we will definitely go further in depth into that.
Okay.
Steve?
Well, I'm going to go on to the numbers, and maybe this is in the choir. Number 6 is singing with many. It is impossible to pray with the wordless prayer of the Spirit, but your mind should be engaged in contemplation of words being chanted or read, or you should say some definite prayer while you're awaiting for an alternate verse. I'm not sure when I think it's impossible to pray with the wordless prayer. I guess you're talking about like the Jesus prayer.
Correct. So the Jesus prayer, which requires focus and concentration on the prayer, obviously you can't do that if you're singing in the choir. That's impossible.
On the other hand, that's a type of prayer in itself.
Which is exactly what it says. Then that, since you cannot do the wordless prayer, the Jesus prayer, then you need to focus, really focus on what you're chanting, what you're singing. Because that's important at that juncture. And it said basically, if you want, in between, because remember, the choirs would be antiphonal. So there'd be, one side, then the other side would sing. So while the other side is singing, you would take that opportunity to go, okay, now I'm going to focus a little bit on my personal private prayer, maybe the Jesus prayer, until it's time for me to sing again.
Now, okay, as you know, I'm in favor of Greek being used in the church, even though it's not my language, I struggle with it. Now, if I said before, when you're singing, it's a prayer in itself. When you're singing or chanting, it's a prayer in itself. If I'm singing in Greek and I don't understand the words, I still believe it's a prayer. And it conveys a prayer, even though I might not understand every word you say.
There is an element of truth to that, Steve, but the reality is that we can get distracted in the melody, but what's important for us is to actually understand what we are actually praying. So one of the things that I recommend to people to do, and maybe you all can do this as kind of a choir retreat when you're finally able to come back, is over the Greek, write the translation. So that as you're singing it, and it's in the Greek, obviously you don't understand the Greek, but you see the word right above the Greek word that you're chanting. It's like, okay, I'm singing this word. I know what this word means. I guarantee you it's going to add depth and power to what you are actually praying. Because we need to understand what we're praying. Because this is one of the differences between that Pentecostal idea of praying in tongues, where you've heard me tell the story about the Kenyan priest that went to a evangelical thing where they were all speaking in tongues, and he got upset because somebody was blaspheming God in Swahili. And the reason why is because they didn't know what they were actually saying. So they're being conduits. So while, yes, it is true that the Greek is beautiful, and it is, the original language, and the music is tailored to it, it's also important that we try to understand what we are praying, because that is how it's able to pierce our heart. When you're actually understanding, wait, God said what? This is about what? Especially during the Orthodox, which I wish more people could understand, that to understand kind of what is actually being taught, the majority of the theology of the church can be found in the hymnology of the church. And so it's very important to understand that. Obviously, I like the Greek too. But I also want us to understand what we are praying, because that allows it to penetrate us in a way that is better than just the music itself.
Father?
So yes.
I'm sorry. I was going to say stuff, but I see my husband over here wants to say something, so I'm going to turn it over to him about what you're saying.
Oh, I was just thinking as you were saying that, how beautiful the service was Sunday when the chanter was saying the verse in English for one or two lines, and then he repeated it in Greek and over, and it meant so much more being able to hear it in English like that. It was just beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the first thing Dick was telling me is that, oh, wow, this was so meaningful. I love this, because, after a while, I mean, even if you know Greek, I mean, I don't know Greek that well, but I mean, you hear it, and I love the Greek because to me it speaks to my soul. But for my husband, hearing it, understanding the words in English really spoke to him. Really, I mean, he was so elated after hearing that. It meant so much to him. So it is.
Yeah, I had a woman in Sioux City who said to me that a priest said, you know, the prayer that I start most of my services with, the Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth. Well, in Greek it's the Basil, and she had heard Basil probably 10,000 times growing up. She heard a priest say, Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth. She said, that's the most beautiful prayer I've ever heard. A prayer to the Holy Spirit. My gosh, where is that? The priest looked at her incredulously. He's like, what are you talking about? That's the prayer that literally starts every single service. How have you not heard it before? He said, well, what do you mean? He's like, you've never heard Vasile Borani? He's like, oh, I've heard that. But you didn't know what it meant?
Wow.
The prayers can't be empty words. They have to have meaning. There has to be depth to it. So I'm not against the Greek, but I also want us to not lose the meaning.
Father, there was one time, and I can't remember whether you were the priest or Father Pangalema was still the priest, but there was an attempt to change the music, not just the word, not the word, the actual music of Say You, and we were also changing to English. And everyone in the choir felt that the most sacred, that the singing of that hymn was really one of the most sacred moments in whatever language of the whole world. I mean,
Yes.
it's almost unanimous agreement.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I really do think that especially nowadays, since we have the Byzantine Music Project, we have so many different translations, is that you really ought to be able to, because prior to maybe 10, 15 years ago, you couldn't really do this, but you should be able to put the Greek and the English music together, and there should be no difference. Because we are able to chant it now in English with the Byzantine music to sound exactly the same. I understand back in the days when we didn't have good translations and it was, I mean, if you've ever tried chanting in English, it is markedly harder than chanting in Greek. Greek is all vowels. It lends itself to musicality very, very well. And for the poetry that was written. English is a very consonant-heavy language. It's very, very hard. But over the years, between 3 or 4 different translators, we've gotten better at finding the correct wording to be able to match the music. But we're not going to, I don't want to derail our Ladder of Divine Ascent with a language split. Because I think that we all agree that what's most important is to give glory to God. But to the point of what you were looking at, Steve, it's the idea that because you're unable to pray your personal prayer of the heart, you need to focus on the prayer that you are praying. This is one of the reasons why I, as a priest, started doing the silent prayers out loud, and why you hear me read them slowly, because those are important to me, prayers, and especially because they're priestly prayers, I read them slowly so that they can penetrate me as well as the listener, because I want it understood what we're praying about. Dr. Ed?
Yeah, overall, I think these two steps, 19 and 20, follow pretty closely from 18, where we talked about um, being insensible to the spiritual matters, and he talks about that being a death of the soul. And then he opens up with the sleep chapter saying it's an image of death. And so, when our insensibility becomes a matter of habit, it's like we're dead. It's like we're not alive in prayer anymore. And so when he talks about vigilance as a way to combat this, he's talking about standing in prayer and activity and watchfulness. So it's just being aware of, to link it with what we were talking about, being aware of what we're praying, being aware of how we're being even attacked by the demons at times, to watch out for certain things and not just to become insensible to them.
It's amazing to me how even in current days, how we have the philosophy of mindfulness, being intensely aware of what you're doing right here, right now, as a way of self-success, for basically self-actualizing. For a lot of help gurus, they really focus on that, being attentive. And it's amazing to me that we really focus right here as we enter into the latter third of the ladder. I did not intend to say that. It really is focusing on that kind of self-help, that if you're going to be successful, you have to focus. And so you have to be aware of what is going to cause you to lose focus, what is going to allow you to become drowsy, to be distracted. And so that's why you have to be standing. That's why you have to be attentive. That's why we talked about before about fasting being a way of being aggressively mindful so that you're not sluggish. All right. Yes.
And I can't. I'm trying to remember things. Where you're in church and you hear like the "Lord, yes, me," I think they called it.
Yes.
That to push, to just sort of bat them away.
Correct. I mean, it's in church where you get the luggies me. It's like, oh, what are they wearing? Oh, why are they doing that? Oh, that person, why is he taking communion? He's a whatever. That's when you are getting attacked more than anywhere, is at church and in prayer. Why? Because obviously the more you are able to focus on the prayer, the more you are able to depart from the grasp of the enemy. All right, so Mrs. Tobias, in step 19, what was your favorite or most confusing verse?
Let me see here. I think I sort of like 3. We already discussed 6, and 6 was, I like that, but we discussed that pretty much. But I liked 3, where we're talking about, some of us, in other words, when you're in church and it's time to go to church, there's things that, sort of stop us, He's talking about monks, but it's also us too, where we have, something happens where somehow you don't want to go to church, and I don't know if we've all felt that. I know I have felt that sometimes, and I think to myself, why, especially when I was working, I'm not working now, but retired, but, why is it on Sunday, and, it's just like, you're getting up later, you're leaving later at the house than you would if you're going to work, but somehow it's just an ordeal sometimes. And I was reading that and I said, yes, I can relate to that.
Mm-hmm. It's it's ubiquitous. I mean, you can get up every other day of the week except for the day of prayer. That's by design. Dr. Tobias?
I like 5 because it takes the monk going out into the desert for the solitary few to be able to really pray. But I also had a question mark on 7 that I wanted to explain that. Maybe we don't know that much about St. Anthony, so if you could explain what he was talking about.
I mean, accessory
Number
an
7.
accessory work or handiwork is, it has its place, it has its time. Saint Basil the Great, had set it up basically 8 hours of work, 8 hours of prayer, 8 hours of rest, and so there's a time for work. And what he's basically saying, when it's time to pray, focus on prayer. Don't have other things going on because anything can turn into a distraction.
Who's Anthony the Great?
Anthony the Great is considered the ultimate monastic. So anyone that's named Tony, they're named after him. We could go into great detail on the life of Saint Anthony, but he is considered the principal monk. He is the one that achieved basically absolute spiritual perfection. When he died in the 4th century, over 100 years, he had all his teeth, which at that time period, that's insane. He had perfect vision, and he was upright and in complete control of his faculties. This is a man that was able to achieve true focus and true prayer.
And it sounds like an angel attended him, so it was an angel there with him.
Yes. Because once you achieve, certain gifts, your spiritual eyes open, you can actually see things. There are stories of priests that were able to see their guardian angels serving liturgy with them. When we open our eyes to the reality of what's going on around us, you can actually see spiritual things. All right, so we picked on 6. And Steve, we picked one of yours too, didn't we?
Well, I was wondering.
Yeah. Pat, did we pick one of yours?
No, I really like number 3 because it's so specific. It tells us all of the ways the demons can tempt us. They make you yawn in church, they make you talk in church, they make you laugh, they make you speed up the reading, they make you lean against the wall instead of standing straight. All of these different ways they try to take us out of the prayerful mode. So anyway, I like that.
And again, you see that it talks about the negative before it switches over to the positive. I love that. He who realizes, in other words, wakes up to himself, that he is standing before God, will be as still as a pillar during prayer and will pray with heartfelt feeling. In other words, if you're before your judge, you're not going to be lazing and lay about, You're going to be, yes, sir. Dr. Ed?
First, right?
Yeah, that last part that you just talked about, the end of number 3, was the one I had doubly highlighted. And when I was kind of just pre-associating in my mind, I thought of the words of Jacob when he woke up from his dream and he said, "Surely the Lord was in this place, and I didn't know it." So it's kind of just, you take the chance, you take an opportunity to just think about what you're doing and where you are, you'll realize that you're in the presence of God and how powerful that is.
Exactly. We see why some of the saints did the things that they did, like Seraphim of Saros, kneeling for 100 days on a rock. The Stylites standing on pillars for years. We see that they did all of this not to look amazing, but to basically focus on what they were trying to do. So let's go ahead and segue right into 20 on bodily vigil and how to attain spiritual vigil and how to practice it. Because again, like Dr. Ed was saying, these are two kind of connected, the idea of prayer and vigil. So let's go ahead and actually we'll go in reverse order. We'll start with Dr. Ed this time, and we'll go that way.
Going through my list here. Well, I had a couple that were pretty interesting. And that's what we're doing, right? We're doing our favorite.
Yep, because they're connected. We don't need to go over broad strokes on these two.
So the one I have highlighted here, I have a few, but number 19, when prayer is finished, wait soberly and you will see that swarms of demons, as if challenged by us, try to invade us after prayer with absurd fantasies. Sit and watch, and you will see those who are in the habit of snatching away the first fruits of the soul. And that's powerful. I mean, this is something that I've spoken with you about, and I think you've mentioned it, that when we even when we receive communion in church, that's the time that we need to be most vigilant and hyper protective of that grace, because that's when the demons are most likely to attack us. And so when it's those moments when we come out of prayer, you need kind of like a cool down period after a workout. You need to stay aware so that you don't leave yourself open to attack right away.
I like that. But again, it feeds itself back into the idea of attentiveness, being aware of what is happening. You basically, by having communion with God within your prayer, declared war against the enemy. And more to the point, if it was good prayer, you expelled the enemy out of you. So it's almost like an action scene in a movie. You punch somebody down, he's going to get back up. And he's going to try to really take it to you. Is it any wonder that almost immediately after prayer, sometimes fights can break out between couples? You just prayed, and now suddenly you're irascible.
Yeah. And that first week of Lent is always the worst.
Because we just forgave each other. And that's exactly it. The enemy is trying to destroy and deflower and spoil the good thing that you have given or been given. Steve?
Well, I kind of like number 2 because it talks about all the different ways that you can kind of really emphasize and focus your prayer, whether it be holding your arms out or and other things. The important thing is that no matter if you are focused in prayer, no matter what the outward indication of that might be, God accepts that. And God focuses back in that.
Right. That's exactly it, is that your intention matters more than even the prayer itself. The fact that you are fighting and trying and getting knocked down and getting back up again, no matter what you have to do it, whether you're engaged in work, whatever you're engaged in, to try to focus on your prayer, God rewards it. There's I can't remember if it's a psalm or another one of the prayers where it says God recognizes even the fraction of a teardrop. Even if we're not bawling for our sins, even a fraction, he sees it, he loves it, he honors it. And so he's the one that makes it grow. So no matter what you do, God accepts it and values it according to your ability. Pat?
I was looking at number 11, long sleep robs the lazy of fasting life. But and that's a good point, of course. But in step 19.1, he ends with saying that we often long for the consolation of sleep. And I know for me sometimes sleep is a consolation. If you've had a difficult day or you're feeling really troubled over something, I do find consolation in sleep. So I guess we have to be vigilant, right, that we're not sleeping too much because it's also robbing us of life.
If we're being lazy, sleep has to have its proper course. Now, granted, some monks are like superhuman. They can sleep like 3 hours and they're ready to go.
Yeah.
I would say, whatever your doctor recommends, do. It's just, sometimes we can make sleep into an idol unto itself. And one thing I've noticed is that the more you sleep, let's say you say, I'm going to have a bed day. And then it's hard to wake up. It's hard to just focus again. And it's like when you take a nap that's too long. You're groggy, you're grumpy, you're grouchy.
But when people are depressed, they seek solace in sleep. They seek escape of sleep.
Exactly. And so
I
instead of
think
being able to help themselves,
a blessing.
yeah. It's a sad, sad thing.
Yeah.
Dr. Tobias?
I was kind of between, 3 to 7. It almost sounds like one of those Confucius say, a vigilant eye makes the mind pure, but much sleep binds the soul. And then a vigilant monk is a foe of fornication, but sleeping with mates with it. I mean, these all sound like those
Maxims.
cookie type things.
Yeah, they're maxims, essentially. They're things to focus on, to recognize if you don't focus and try to stay awake mentally, spiritually, you will be bound. And if you're trying to fight, carnal lusts, if you're not focusing, you're going to get pulled into it. Mrs. Tobias?
Yeah, I had two. One, number 8, I was concerned a little bit for me because it said the preparing of the table exposes gluttons. And I'm thinking about things like, when you have a big feast and you have, maybe it's Pascha and you're having a lamb, or Easter, or Christmas if you're having a lamb or turkey or whatever, or you have these luscious desserts come by, you think, oh my God, you just sort of like, wow, that's, you're thinking, yum, I definitely need room for that. That is yummy. And I'm thinking like, looking at this, it sounds like that's really bad.
Well, it is, because when we make food our idol, then we're looking only at the flesh instead of focusing on prayer. So what he's saying is that basically the fruit of your labor is made evident. So prayer exposes the lover of God. Somebody that is going nuts for preparing the feast is like, ooh, we're going to feast.
Like something like when they were saying somewhere back where people, instead of during the time of fasting, are thinking about preparing the lamb dinner, focusing on that instead of fasting or something like that. Is that what like you're saying?
Right. So in other words, you're trying to avoid, giving into lack of self-control.
Okay, and the other was 10, and I thought, okay, what he's saying there, the farmer is anybody who, in other words, as you work and you gather the things or the products of your efforts, that's good, I guess, in the sense that that's what your job is, so to speak. But the real wealth, this is what I like, but the real wealth, the real tangible thing are when you pray and you are sincere in prayer, that those fruits are the real wealth.
Right, that's practical knowledge and practical growth in your spiritual life. Things that are actually real and not just theoretical.
I'd just like to go back to point number 8 for a minute. There's another way to look at this from a motivated perhaps. If we get so excited about a feast meal, why shouldn't we be able to get as excited about prayer or more?
Correct. If we're judged by the fruits of our works, shouldn't the fruit of our work be prayer?
Father, can you explain number 20? That was really a difficult one, especially when he talks about, I would not have mentioned the third case, and I don't see a third case here. I really don't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, I agree. I had a question on that too.
Yeah.
Let's see. It may happen that continuous meditation on passages of the Psalms is prolonged into the hour of sleep. And it may happen that the demons put these passages into our mind in order to lead us into pride. I would not have mentioned the third case had not someone forced me to do so. And that's what he's about to mention. The soul which is spent all day unceasingly engaged with the word of the Lord will love to be occupied with it in sleep too. For this second grace is in a special sense a reward for the first and helps us avoid the falls and fantasies.
I got
In other
lost
words,
in the first, second, and third business.
I know it's kind of... All right, so the next one is fun. On unmanly and puerile cowardice. All right, Dr. Tobias, what are your overarching thoughts on this?
Well, I think number 2 kind of explains it. Cowardice is a childish disposition in an old vainglorious soul. Cowardice is falling away from faith that comes of expecting the unexpected. I think that puts it in a nutshell.
It does, in a sense, because what are we looking at? The idea of vainglory is thinking that we're somehow more regal, more up than we have a right to be, and yet it is childish because it's unmanly. As a child fears, addressing something, so also we are afraid of addressing the assaults of the enemy when it's taking certain forms. Mrs. Tobias?
Yeah, the overall aspect of this also is that you can't do this in one step. That to take away your fear. That needs to be a process. Is what I'm seeing, and I don't know if it was this one as I'm looking at about expecting the unexpected, but to accept, maybe not this step, because sometimes they sort of run together. I'm not sure if it's in this step or not, where you basically don't want to, like if something unexpected happens, you're not accepting it, that you need to accept the unexpected as well. Now that may be from another step, but that's what I thought. But overall, like what the first said, like what Dr. Tobias said as well. But by making choosing, he said, step, that it's a slow process. That's what I'm saying.
Yes, it definitely is. And the thing about it is that cowardice, when it says here, cowardice is falling away from faith that comes of expecting the unexpected, it's, manifold of two things. One, it's like, well, unless I expected it, I'm not ready to deal with it, and therefore I'm terrified of the unexpected, and I have no faith that I'm able to deal with it or that God will get me through it. Pat?
Okay. What I got out of this whole step was kind of in number 11. The only legitimate fear is the fear of God. And he seems to kind of scoff at a lot of the other fears. And I'm looking at 3 where he says, fear is the rehearsing of danger beforehand. And to me that's like saying, well, what if this happens? Well, oh my gosh, what if this happens? What if this happens? And you get yourself into such a state of fear by thinking of all these what ifs before they ever happen. And you shouldn't be worried about that. You won't be fearing God.
Correct. I mean, you kind of touch on the 2 antipodes there, Pat, which is really, very, very powerful, is that fear has a way of paralyzing us because we're so scared of a potential future. And sometimes we rehearse in our minds a potential future that is most horrible. And because it's all we can think about, we can't move forward. We're too scared. Whereas if we actually feared God, which would mean that we trusted God, we wouldn't fear anything else because it's like having your big brother on the playground.
Right.
Nothing can stop you.
Right.
Now, I need to make it understood here because we're kind of dealing with 2 layers here. One, of course, is fear of the physical, and the other is more, which is more to the point, fear of the spiritual. Because sometimes people will look at things and say, well, God doesn't protect everybody. God allows children to be killed and to have horrible things happen to them. So God is clearly not protecting. So what is God? What are we talking about here? Well, what we're talking about here is not that God is going to always protect you from evil people, but will protect your soul from the true enemy that is trying to destroy you. Steve?
Well, the last sentence of number 3, I think that's a lot too. Fear is the loss of conviction.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can't base anything, I mean, what you have no belief in, you have no trust in anything, either in yourself or.
I go back to my quote from my dad, who would,
Right. You
yeah,
don't stand for something.
you'll fall for everything.
Right.
Which means that if you don't have a conviction, you can't stand on anything. You don't know what's real. You don't know what's true. And because you have nothing to stand on, there is no solid foundation for you. So, you're going to be like that person on the bridge, shaking and unable to move.
I was listening to a lot of Bob Dylan lately, and one of his things he thinks is everyone has a master. It's either going to, he goes through very certain examples, things you might do, but every verse he goes through, it's either going to be the devil or the Lord.
Right. That's
Amen. Dr. Ed?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we've already hit all the points that I really took out of it, but I think, he connects the idea of fear being a lack of trust in God, and he links it to vainglorious people, because vainglorious people, they don't want to be seen as failures, so they imagine situations where they'll fail. Instead of trusting that God has brought them through situations to actually see them through it. And I've actually read certain saints recommend you shouldn't think about these situations and these terrible situations that maybe are even being realized in other people's lives, and how you'll react in those, because God grants you the grace when it's proper to you. And so to imagine, what would I do in this scenario is kind of almost a futile exercise in the mind, that you should trust, like the Lord tells us. He says, when they bring you before the courts, the Spirit will tell you what to say. So you can link that with several different things. Like when you're brought to some challenge, the Lord will give you the grace to see you through it.
Couldn't say it any better myself.
I have a note down here that says, I think it's after 7, between 7 and 8. I wrote, the worst that can happen is death, which we would not be fearful of if we constantly remember death.
It's true. The saints were not afraid of death. What are you going to do? Kill me? Okay. That accomplishes nothing. I'm immortal. I will live forever. The glory of my God is not something that you can contest with. So go ahead, take my life. It perfects me. And that was one of the things that even in the early days, people could not understand about Christians. How is this possible? In the Tower of London, they came to a conclusion. You've probably heard the expression, "Show me the man, I'll find the crime," and that was because they would subject these people to torture, and they rationed that every person has a breaking point where they will just out of insanity, they'll tell you whatever they want, whatever you want to hear. They'll sign their name to it, just to stop the torture, just to make you stop. And the saints didn't stop. They would, even after being burned, even after being raked, even after being sawed in two, they were not stopping. They were not afraid. Death was not something that they were worried about. one of the things that was interesting for Constantine the Great, he had a lot of Christian soldiers. And the reason why he had Christian soldiers was because most of the Christian soldiers had an edge on other combatants. They weren't afraid to die. And because they weren't afraid to die, they were able to be very valiant. So it's amazing what faith can do to fear, to understand that death has no dominion. Death, where is thy sting? So with that, let's go ahead and move right into the big one. Well, half of the big one, because as he says himself, they're technically united. But we're only going to go into the first one today since we won't have time for the second. Dr. Ed, we'll go ahead and start with you for this one, since we robbed you of the thunders in the previous one.
Yeah, I think there was. I really appreciated the way that you linked this with pride. I mean, this is like a precursor to pride almost. But you know, I think there are several here that really were kind of interesting. You know, number 5 really kind of gets at some of the trouble that I think everybody deals with, but I can only speak for myself. I am vainglorious when I fast, so you struggle in certain ways, and then you're proud when you succeed in them, and then you recognize that you become vainglorious, and then you humble yourself again, and humbling yourself is like, oh, I'm proud that I cut that off at the right time.
It's like, no matter what you do, I love how he ended it. Throw the prickly pear, no matter what, it ends up spike up. But that's the thing, is that the only way to deal with this is to understand just how dangerous it is and how sinister it is, that it will twist your motives. Remember, everything's about intention. And so what this is basically showing is that my intention keeps getting, pulled back to vaingloriousness, whether it's on the negative or on the positive.
And what's your understanding of the distinction between pride and vainglory? I'm not sure I grasp the real distinction.
Yeah, I agree in certain ways. I think that at some point he says that vainglory is the precursor to it. And so I think that there's vainglory is, and Father will correct me when I deny this, but I think it's you're doing things to be noticed. There's an element of man-pleasing that seems to just keep cropping up in this section. And I think that pride is sort of more of a, at least we haven't gotten there, but I see it as more of an internal sort of sense of yourself, not necessarily linked to constantly making a show of it.
I almost felt like, to understand this vainglory, I had to go ahead and read the next one, read about pride, because I really wasn't understanding the distinction.
This is one of the reasons why St. Gregory the Theologian, as St. John the Latter quotes, basically says, there is only 7 deadly sins. Pride is the deadly sin. Vainglory ramps you up to it. And so if you really look at step 35, when he relates the story of the holy man who had both vainglory and pride sit on either side of him, it really kind of talks about, what is the difference. Vainglory is that element of man-pleasing that starts you up. And then once you get puffed up, then pride jumps in and then lifts you up just to smash you down, making you arrogant in your accomplishments, and brings you to ruinous destruction.
I mean, like reading this was almost damn if you do, damn if you don't. But like when you compliment someone, and so and you sincerely, do that, is it saying you shouldn't be doing that because you might be puffing up the person?
No, in fact, it said if somebody's annoying you, compliment them. He wasn't saying that to be, glib or to be malicious. Like, okay, compliment them. he was being sincere. It's like, put the other above yourself. Find good in the other person. But this is one of the reasons why we see from the Psalms where it says, and we read this during every comp line, the psalm that this holy man is referring to, where it says, "Get away from me, you who say to me, well done, well done." And he talks in another place about how a good person will be able to handle when people are saying bad things about you. A saint will be able to handle it when things are being spoken of well of him. And so the big danger is man-pleasing. Are you doing what you're doing because you want people to think you're good? That's the question. And ultimately, what becomes the most dangerous of all is that this isn't taking place on the outside. It's taking place on the inside. Because only you know that. And the problem is, and this is where St. John was talking about the, like you said very well, damned if you do, damned if you don't, is your motivation can change on a dime. You think you're doing it for this, and then you go, oh, good for me that I did it again. I conquered, I did it again.
Well, that's like on the further one where they said the monk was able to eat with the lady and have a conversation, was not affected by her wiles or anything like that. But then they said then he opened himself up to a worse sin, I guess, saying like, oh, look how I did, I was not affected by that. So that's, I guess, worse than the other. Is what
that was pride. I mean, that was his pride of thinking that I've conquered it. And that's where basically he probably was, pleasing to the other people. Like, wow, they all saw me as good. They saw that I was able to do this, and I am able to eat with women and not be affected. Then pride snatched him and threw him down.
Father, when you look at all this, you think like, how are we ever going to be? I mean, I know probably what you're going to say, but it's like, how can we? I mean, I read these things and I say, well, I'm guilty of this vainglory a lot. I'm not doing it like for me. I mean, I'll say things and it'll be like, I mean, I just see myself being guilty of a lot of this. I think like, well, how can we? And then it talked. I don't know if it was this one, another one, like, oh, well, we've seen people thrown out of heaven for like this minor little thing, pride. And I'm thinking like, well, how are we ever going to be able to ascend when it's like.
You have to understand, and this is why this is later in the ladder, is because all the things that we've been talking about are all trying to chip away at the monster that is these two steps. This is the crowning achievement of evil, pride and vainglory. It is the entrance and the end of all of it. Just like love is the beginning and the end of all virtues, pride and vainglory as its entry point is the crowning achievement of our destruction. Why are we not able to judge? Or why are we not able to not judge people? Because we constantly, because of our own pride and our self-worth and our desire to be seen as a certain way in front of people, we can't forgive. We can't allow. We can't turn the cheek. So we are, caught up in this deadly, deadly vice, this game that the evil one keeps preying on. All of the other sins lead back here.
Yeah, well, Father, I mean, it's like we all, strive to do better and success, and we're happy when we're able to succeed, but it sounds like that's not a good thing.
It, again, comes back to intent. There's a difference between being happy that God has delivered me versus I succeeded.
Oh, well, I feel better now because I know it's not me. Okay.
When we look at it and say, God has rescued me, God has saved me, I put my trust in Him. By putting our trust in pride in Him, then we're okay. Problem is we don't do that. Most of us do not differentiate, these moments of victory. We internalize them as our own. And there's another point where it talks about, the person that's, vainglorious, that was born with certain good things, like able to read, able to speak, to sing, to do all these things naturally, and is not humble about it. That person is in big trouble.
Yeah, I remember that. I don't know if it was in this one or another one.
Yeah,
And I
that
thought, whoa. I mean, you have a natural ability, and they're doing it without pride to do it. But it is just natural. But it still is from God, is it not?
The gifts are from God, but the
Yeah,
way we
yeah.
deal with them are completely different.
Okay.
That's why, inviting it in is the problem. When we invite glory, when we invite trying to have people like us, that's a problem.
Father,
Because if you're
was
Go
it
ahead.
in this one or another one where, like somebody that, was faithful and didn't sin, was a good person. I mean, he'll get some glory and such, but someone who sinned and then repented, it sounded almost like this person's better. Much more accolades or something to that effect, for that person. Like, it reminded me of the prodigal son, but it sounded like, here's a person who did everything right, and he's not held as in high esteem as the one who sinned, repented, and came back to him.
Here's the reality. As we hear during the funeral service, there is no one who has not sinned. Only Christ is without sin. But what we're trying to understand with that saying, and this is why Jesus Christ says, there is more joy for the lost lamb than for the 99 who didn't go astray. There is more rejoicing over the lost coin that was found. The idea basically being that there is joy and rejoicing over the redemption, over the return. And so that's one of the reasons why we look to St. Mary of Egypt, someone who fell so catastrophically hard, but then through her repentance was raised higher than the most saintly man of his era. And so what we're looking to that is to understand that, our redemption is possible. And there's a reason why a lot of times saints are not revealed in their lifetime. They're revealed after they've been dead a long, long time. So we kind of got a little off course. So we will come back to 22 and 23 next week, and we'll just stay on those two because I think that this is a very important element. The first Wednesday in April, we will be not having class. We will be having our guest speaker for the prison ministry.
Did you set it up with them?
Yeah, we've set it up, and we're going to be working on the advertising.
Oh, wow. Okay, oh, great, thanks, Father.
I'm going to be giving him the link, so he'll have his followers as well. So it'll be St. Basil and all of his people, and whoever else wants to join us. I will.
Okay, great.
I mean, I got permission last time, but I'll send the letter asking for permission for him to speak again. Shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah. Okay, great, thanks, Father. I didn't know it was gonna happen so soon. I got a little newsletter story on his prison ministry for the April issue.
Perfect.
So,
I mean, we got time because we've still got the latter 2 weeks of March, but he wanted to do earlier in April. I asked him to do April, and he said earlier would be better.
Nice.
All right. Any closing thoughts or questions, everybody?
No.
Just, I had a similar thought as Tobias on the idea of not praising other people and not, well, I mean, okay, when you use the word flatter other people, I mean, that's a little bit more, the word flatter has certain connotations to it because that's oftentimes phony, but it also warns us about praising other people and, I mean, I thought that we should, like especially people who are kind of humble and kind of quiet and think not confident in themselves. We should be, I thought we always should be encouraging them by saying things that are true, but that that encourages them, that gives them more confidence.
We need to talk about this step more. Yeah.
Well, and that's why we're going to do
Yeah,
a lot more
right,
in depth next week.
Yeah.
But the reality is that there's a fine line here, because on the one hand you want somebody to be, lifted up so that they're able to be encouraged and move forward, but on the other hand you don't want them to tip over into man-pleasing vainglory. And so what you're really doing is you're walking a tightrope. So picture somebody like holding a one of those big poles, and they're standing on the rope, and it's a razor thin rope, and either way you can fall off.
Yeah.
And so it's a very fine line that you're moving, and sometimes you've got to lean a little one way, lean a little another way, and sometimes you need to help people along the way too, so that they don't despair.
Right.
But again, it's a very careful thing, because you also don't want them to be, addicted to praise, or to be seeking only the praise of men.
And Father, maybe next time also you could talk to us about like children. Like I know as a mother, I always wanted to lift up my children and praise them.
Right.
I mean,
So we have to understand again that when you were raising our children, what are we raising them to be? Are we raising them to be seeking only the glory of men and attention, or are we trying to seek out altruistic individuals that are trying to do the right thing, regardless of whether anyone sees it or not? Because one of the things we see, especially in today's culture, where people really put a lot of emphasis on your identity, whether it's your social media identity or your identity in the public sphere. If that's lost, then you're lost. It's gone. It's forever. It's a big deal. Whereas, what happened to raising people that at the end of the day, regardless of what the world thinks, if you can look yourself in the mirror and know you're doing the right thing, it doesn't matter. And so we always need to look to people like St. Nectarius, who was maligned his whole life, never seemed to let it bother him. Didn't care. It didn't matter to him that all these lies were being said about him, or that he got chased from place to place to place. Because he was humble. He wasn't a man pleaser. He was only trying to please God. But we'll talk about this a lot more in depth next week. Dr. Ed, any final thoughts?
No more words. But I do think that it is funny. I think it's a bit of a joke. I know he doesn't mean it this way, but after all these words, warning against flattering people, warning against praising them too much, then in number 15 he says, when you hear that your neighbor has praised you, or when you hear that your neighbor is, or your neighbor or friend has abused you behind your back, or even to your face, then show love and praise them. Wait, that sounds like you're getting revenge a little bit.
I know. That's why I said that he's not saying that maliciously.
Kill them with kindness.
But it's not being said out of malice or vengeance. The idea of praise the other person. That person who, even though they're wronging you, even though they're going behind your back and saying horrible things about you, you still praise them as if they're wonderful people. And you believe that they're wonderful people. Because in so doing, you humble yourself.
Well, the other thing,
Father, that's really hard. I remember reading that line too, and I was thinking the same thing. That's a little hard. I mean, I wouldn't do something like revenge, but I'd be hurt.
Right. Well, remember why when he said that, like remembrance of wrongs, that you've only achieved victory over this. And again, these are all united. Like Dr. Ed said from the beginning, there's a line going through all of this. You've only achieved victory when that person that wronged you, lied about you, did this to you, when harm comes to them and you are genuinely grieved and weeping for them.
well, the other side of it is when you are praised, so much, the only way to deal with that is not let it get to you,